Hey everyone, this is Peter Zablocki, the host of the Daily History Shorts podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. If this is your first time stopping by, I hope you stick around and return tomorrow for more fun history. And if you enjoy these Friday conversation series, you can always find the entire backlog of conversations with historians, authors, Pulitzer Prize winners, and much more under the Conversations tab on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Today's conversation is proudly brought to you by The Collector, your destination for captivating stories that teach, inform, and inspire millions of readers every day. From ancient history to today's defining moments, from philosophy and art to exclusive interviews, discover more at thecollector.com. Today we welcome back Roger Moorhouse, a leading authority on Nazi Germany, World War II, and Central European history. Roger has authored several groundbreaking works, including The Devil's Alliance, Poland 1939, and The Forgers, shedding light on the darker corners of the 20th century conflicts. Today we talk about his newest book, Wolfpack, Inside Hitler's U-Boat War, a story which takes us deep into the perilous world of German submariners during the Battle of the Atlantic, one of the longest and most brutal campaigns of the war. Well, Roger, welcome back to the show since you are a guest that's been here before. Welcome back.
I am indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me back on, Peter.
What was the impetus for this latest book, and how does your retelling differ from the historiography on this subject that came before your retelling?
Well, the impetus, I suppose, is a fairly kind of straightforward one. I mean, I'm a popular historian. I haven't really done naval history before, to be honest. So, it's not like I've been studying this for 20 years. Unfortunately, I can't say that. But it just struck me that, that this was a subject that actually I found really interesting. I'd been fascinated for years by the U-boat war. I'm of a generation that remembers, Das Boot the first time round, when that came around in 81. I can remember watching it kind of, with aghast, with mouth wide open, kind of going, oh my God, that's not only was it so good and so unbelievably dramatic, but also, it kind of told a story that we hadn't really been told before. And that sort of brings you round to the sort of the slightly more, I suppose, professional rationale for the book, which is that, to tell the story of the U-boat war and the Battle of the Atlantic, essentially from a German perspective, is actually quite novel. It has been the subject's been written about quite a lot, but it's almost always written about from the perspective of, the surface of the destroyers and the escorts and so on, the merchantmen, in the English speaking historiography. So to sort of flip that by 180 degrees, I thought, well, that would be a really interesting approach to actually flip it from the perspective of the surface to the perspective of the U-boat and sort of say, well, what did it look like for them? What was their experience of the Battle of the Atlantic? What did they eat? What was their training like? What was it like to spend 2 months on a U-boat? And as soon as you shift that perspective, a shift of perspective is almost like, discovering a new archive, because it kind of forces you to seek out new voices, new materials, new archival sources and so on. So it's actually, it's been a really interesting exercise to do that. And as I said, I think it does in the process actually shed an interesting light on the broader subject. So not only are, the fact, this aspect of the conditions that they sort of lived and worked under, which are absolutely horrific. And we can, that's something we can go into. And again, I mean, given that the U-boat force is actually, much larger than any of the Allied submarine forces, and is a much more significant sort of weapon in the overall struggle, if you like, the overall battle for sort of, naval, not only naval supremacy, but for the winning of the war as a whole. There are, of course, comparisons to make, but I just look at the German stuff, and it is horrific. They've got young men going into the service who really don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're expecting, and their life expectancy by the end of the war, the last year of the war, is less than one mission. Is effectively going out on suicide missions. So um, it's absolutely brutal, and I just wanted to try and bring that across as effectively as possible using all those German sources. Um, so that to me was the sort of the rationale for the book, was to try and first of all just tell a story that hadn't really been told in the way that I wanted to tell it, and I think that's a contribution as well to the historiography. Why wouldn't we want to know what German crews went through during World War II? And there's one just little coda to that, which is that there was a sort of a personal aspect to this, which was that I was having a lunch, family lunch, when I'd actually started already researching the book, and my mother-in-law, who is German, um, announced to me that, in a quite sort of matter-of-fact manner, said, "Yeah, well, one of my uncles was in the U-boats," and I kind of went like, "What? Like, how come you didn't tell me this before?" kind of thing. He said, "Yeah, no, he was in the U-boats and he survived." And I went, "Okay, so he's in a minority there for one thing, right?" Um, yeah, and he survived. And she said, "Oh, I remember him. Remember him coming to the house when she was young. He used to come to the house, and he was actually consigned to psychiatric institutions because of his experiences. So he used to kind of escape, and the only place he knew to go was like the family home. So he would go to the family home and turn up in the middle of the night, and they had to call the police to come and get him and take him back again. Right? It's horrible. So the experience of the U-boat war for him, I'm not saying that was the experience of all of the survivors. Only 1 in 4 actually survived of U-boatmen from World War II. But for him, it was a life sentence. He'd spent the rest of his short life in a series of psychiatric hospitals. So that sort of made me think, I should really try and bring that across, that the reality of this story. So that was a sort of an added impetus.
Yeah, it's interesting because we always talk about history from top down, and then there's the reversal of it. Well, let's talk about history from bottom up, and yours is literally and figuratively speaking from the bottom up. Placing the focus on these young men, right? Because many of the U-boat sailors were young and they were mostly conscripted. How does this class ideology and personal motivations influence their effectiveness once they are on a job? And what does this reveal about the broader societal fabric of Nazi Germany, that these are young men that are being conscripted to be part of this?
Yeah, I mean the average age of U-boatmen in World War II is 22, which is kind of astonishing. A lot of the commanders, especially of the sort of second and third generation, you had the first generation commanders, who are people who had been in the Kriegsmarine pre-war, who very often had long experience. So they tended to be older. By about 41, 42, most of them are dead. And then you've got second generation, who are the people that had served them as their sort of, watch officers and so on. So they become the next generation of commanders. And then by the end of the war, you're into the sort of third generation of commanders, who are people, in many cases, who hadn't even been in the Kriegsmarine at the beginning of the war. And very often then you've got commanders who have very limited experience. Sometimes they're only 23, 24 years old, and they're commanding a U-boat. And they've had essentially pretty basic training to actually do so. Certainly not the years of experience of navigation and gunnery and all the rest of it that the first generation had. So you have this kind of winnowing out of the U-boat force, of the crews themselves, that get ever younger, ever less experienced, ever less effective actually, as the war goes on. So interestingly, some of the stats on this are absolutely horrific. One of which was that of U-boats, for example, U-boats that there was this early in the war, there was this phase, they called it the happy time. There was the second happy time, which is 42, when they are kind of almost sinking, and allied merchantmen and so on, almost for fun, right? They're very, very much on the front foot. They are very much the hunters. They're the ones that it feels like the wind is behind them. And the shift, the sort of pivot moment, is 1943. And there's a wonderful stat that says for vessels, U-boats that come into service from 1943 onwards, so for the last 2.5 years of the war, of those vessels, only 14% of them actually sink anything at all. Right, 86% of them don't sink anything, and most of them are sunk in their turn. right? So the way that the war shifts is absolutely horrific and horrendous for them. So and part of the reason for that, there's various reasons, technological, cryptographic and everything else, logistical. But part of the reason is that those crews are much less experienced, much younger. The training has been curtailed to actually get them out into the sea. So there's a sort of almost like a sort of demographic shift in how the crews sort of are sort of put together and the experience that they have in the second half of the war. So to go to your question, what this sort of shows us, what's interesting about this is a lot of the crews that you have, like throughout the war, there's a couple of studies that I drew on that look at the societal background and geographical background of there's not really the stats to do it across the entire force, but there's sort of representative samples that they've used. And it's quite obvious that U-boat crews, more than any other branch of service, are predominantly lower and lower middle class, right? So they tend to be people with trades. So it would be, it's pretty obvious, right? You'd want someone who was, a carpenter or a plumber or a mechanic, someone with skills, with practical skills, because you need that all the time, right? So they tend to be sort of lower and lower middle class for that reason. They also tended to be geographically, they tended to be not from sort of the areas with a seafaring tradition. And you can read what you like into that. Maybe that's just where the sort of the pool of young men was. But the cynic might say, well, they wanted people that didn't know the realities of life at sea. So they're coming to it green, right? So they weren't going to go, I'm not going in a bloody submarine, because that's a death sentence. So they're coming to it essentially green. So, there's various elements there. They tended to come from inland areas, places like Westphalia, Saxony, and so on, Rhineland, rather than, Hamburg, Lübeck, and so on, where there's this very strong naval tradition. So there's various sort of indicators, but beyond that, your U-boat arm is kind of the whole spread of German society. So you get Nazi enthusiasts, you get Nazi opponents as well, and you get everything in between. All of those that kind of just want it all to go away, and all of those that think, well, it's pretty good that Hitler's doing what he's doing because he's making Germany great again. All of that stuff, right? So the whole spectrum of German society. What's interesting, I think, most interesting point that struck me was that I went into this, and as you know from my earlier work, I've done a lot of work on Poland, for example. I'm very well aware through doing that of the absolutely brutal racial and ideologically driven nature of the war in the East, okay, against Poland, against Soviet Union and elsewhere. I was kind of lazily, I suppose, half expecting to see, not similar scale of atrocities, because you don't even see that really in France, but, some evidence of that in the naval war. There's very, very little. There's one documented war crime carried out by the U-boat arm, which is the sinking of the SS Peleus in 1944, very late in the war. There may be others that are lost to history because maybe they killed all the survivors, or the survivors all died, and then the crew themselves were sunk 5 minutes later. It's quite possible, but they're not documented, so we'll never know about them. So as it is, we've got one documented war crime. What you see much more of, particularly in the opening phase of the war, is what I call the solidarity of the sea, which is the U-boat crews actually, surfacing. They used to surface after a sinking to essentially ask what the ship was, because they didn't really know, right? They could kind of broadly tell whether it was enemy or not, but they would surface to say, what was the vessel we've just sunk? Where did it come from? Where was it going? And so on. What was it carrying? So they kind of interrogate survivors. And what was not unusual was that they would give blankets. They would kind of write upturned, lifeboats. They would give them blankets and essentially say, well, this, land is that way. At the very least, sometimes water, sometimes food, cigarettes. There's even an example. So that sort of thing was not unusual, which I found quite surprising, right? Given the reputation that the Nazis bring with them, right? There's even an example. I think it was U-30, which sank a merchant ship, and the standard practice was they would, fire at the opening phase of the war, fire across the bows, stop the ship, ascertain where it was going, whose it was, and so on. And if it was an enemy vessel, enemy registered vessel, they'd say, right, you've got half an hour to get off, and then we're going to sink it. So all the crew would get off into the lifeboats, and then they'd torpedo the vessel. Okay. And because it was running a high sea at the time, this is in the western approaches off Ireland, it was running a high sea. So the captain of the U-boat sank the vessel, and then he sort of lashed up the surviving the lifeboats and towed them to shore, which was 24 hours motoring on the surface. And this is in the middle of the war, and you think that's just insane. So the difference between, the expectation of this being, I mean, it is brutal, of course it is, and lots of people are killed, thousands are killed in the process. And the intention of the U-boat war is to starve Britain into either surrender or to bring it to the table. So, of course, the strategic intent is absolutely brutal, and the practice is brutal, and thousands die in the process. But actually, in carrying that out, it's kind of carried out with a degree of chivalry that I actually found surprising, and that to me was one of the surprises of the book.
As you're doing this research, did you ever think of, or did it send you back to World War I and really like not the height, because I would say the early infancy of U-boat warfare? I'm always curious about that topic. I feel like there's a lot written about Battle of the Atlantic, but never necessarily about the World War I aspect of this U-boat war.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very true. The Germans have been very effective in carrying out U-boat warfare in the First World War. Of course, that's what brought the Americans into the war, the sinking of the Lusitania, with unrestricted U-boat warfare, submarine warfare. So it had been very effective. Also, kind of rather portentous in that sense that there's a view, and you can see this expressed in a couple of the accounts that I cite. There's a view that, in a sense, they're saying we have to kind of do this properly. We have to do this by the rules, because otherwise, look what happens, right? I mean, first of all, there's this thing, the British are just going to, throw their hands up, and it's going to be a propaganda gift. But looming over that is the entry of the Americans into the war. And you can see how the slide to the American entry, which, as we know, of course, comes from Pearl Harbor ultimately in December 1941, but the slide to war, certainly in terms of how Roosevelt sells it to the American people, is almost entirely to do with the Atlantic and increasing German attacks on American shipping, whether it's military or civilian. So the shadow of the First World War actually looms over this probably more than we'd imagine. But it really does. Both, it's in the minds. You can see it's in the minds of the politicians. It's also in the minds of a lot of the German commanders, because they're saying we have to play by the rules, otherwise, we're going to be in trouble.
Do you think the reliance on the U-boat warfare is more of a product of desperation or genius, as far as the Germans are concerned?
It's a good question. Dönitz, who was in command of the U-boat arm in the Second World War, was constantly demanding more. Now, I mean, as you will know, everyone in Nazi Germany who was responsible for any sort of sector of the war economy or any other sector of the fighting forces was constantly demanding, materials, men, raw materials, focus, whatever, just the focus of the high command. And Dönitz no less in that respect, but he didn't really get what he wanted. So he always had this vision of having what he called a 300 U-boat force, which didn't necessarily mean 300 U-boats at sea, but it meant that he could sustain 100 U-boats at sea, and the other 200 would either be refitting or, ferrying to and from to actually go into a combat situation. So it meant that he could maintain, he reckoned, at least 100 U-boats at sea at any one time. He doesn't get that until the end of 1942. He actually goes to war with about 27, ocean-going combat U-boats, which is a tiny, tiny amount. So he never has, certainly until the latter stages of the war, he never really has the force that he wants, the force that he thinks is the minimum that he needs to carry out what he has to do, which is tonnage warfare, right? So this is never, and his argument, which I think is probably fair, is that the potential, the strategic potential of the U-boat warfare, is never really appreciated by his superiors. There's a moment, I think it's in late 41, where sort of Hitler makes this, because of the positive figures that are being scored by the U-boat arm at that point. He says, well, we are going to sort of put some more resources into U-boat building and so on. That's where where ultimately Dönitz gets the force that he wanted. But it's kind of too little too late, because by that point, the Allies are already 2 years into the war. The Americans are already in the war. Liberty ships are going to be coming on stream in due course in the months that follow, which will more than replace those that are being sunk. So, in a sense, the window of opportunity that they had in the opening, say, 2 years of the war has already pretty much closed by the time, Hitler finally realized and appreciated the strategic potential that he had of the U-boat war. So up until then, I think it's just seen as a sideshow. And like Dönitz always complains that Hitler's absolutely obsessed with, continental matters and doesn't really see the potential of the U-boats. And Hitler was also rather obsessed with having these sort of big, surface vessels, the likes of, as we know, the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen and the rest of them. He liked those as sort of baubles, as demonstrations of German power. And the rather more humble U-boat, and sort of scrubbily, rusty little black U-boat that sort of, doesn't look that impressive and spends most of its time out of sight, didn't really send the same message. So it never got the same amount of love that the surface fleet got. And actually, the surface fleet achieved precisely nothing in strategic terms through World War II, whereas the U-boats could have achieved something had that focus been on them earlier in the war.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like a little engine that could.
Yeah.
When you think about it, just kind of general last question. How pivotal do you think the U-boat war was in shaping the overall outcome of World War II? Do you think it prolonged it? Do you think it ended it quicker? What is your general opinion about its role?
It's a very good question, Peter, because I think this is something that particularly in the British historiography on this, I think there's a feeling that this is one of those moments, and it goes, where it sort of almost ranks alongside, the Battle of Britain and, Dunkirk and D-Day as, yes, that was a moment where, essentially it was a campaign that we won, right? And it was crucial. A bit like the Dam Busters. And actually, the Dam Busters, it's a very British story. But it's one of those things, in the grand strategic terms, it does precisely nothing, right? It's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy and a waste of men's lives. It's a big propaganda coup, big propaganda victory. And they do sort of, milk it for all they're worth, but it looms much, much bigger in the post-war historiography than it ever did really at the time, because strategically it's a nothing, right? And a little bit, I think the U-boat war fits into the same category. And the reason for that is Churchill himself. Churchill wrote in his memoir, post-war memoir, that the U-boat war was the only, I think he said the phrase was, the only thing that really frightened him during World War II was the potential of the U-boat war. And I don't think he's being disingenuous. I don't think he's lying. I think he's, in a sense, that rather throwaway comment has been, run with by two generations of historians. Because if you look at it from the other perspective, as I said before, there is a moment, 40-41, where there is potential that had the U-boats been able to sink more vessels before the Americans come in, that you could have, there was genuine concern on behalf of, British politicians and decision makers that this could have a material effect on the British economy, that on the British home front, because of the lack of food and so on. They were talking about tightening their belts even more, even though the belts were already pretty tight. So there was a moment when there was something possible, but the Germans just lacked the numbers to make it tell. And as I said before, by the time they have the numbers from late 42, 43 onwards, that window of opportunity is closed because of the perfection of Allied countermeasures, because of logistics, because of technological advances, because of cryptographic advances with Enigma, all of that coming together, plus those inexperienced crews that I mentioned, all of that sort of comes together in a perfect storm from 43 onwards, meaning that, by the time Dönitz has got the force that he wants, the window's well and truly closed, right? So there was a strategic potential there for this theatre to have been absolutely decisive. But I think it was momentary and it was rather fleeting. And actually, that moment, if you like, because of Churchill's comment, I think has been blown out of all proportion. And in post-war historiography is kind of inflated to a much greater potential than it ever was at the time. And you can kind of see that. This is one of the benefits, I think, of shifting the perspective, is that you can see that from the German side, that from 43 onwards, they're being hunted simply, right? They've turned very much the hunters in the opening phase of the war, but from 43 onwards, they're running scared. They're being sunk in huge numbers. Their life expectancy of a crew starts to plummet. I think from 1943, statistically, it was about 2 to 3 missions, and then that falls off. By 43, 45, you're less than 1 mission. This is not a force that is, by that stage is going to challenge anybody. It's literally running scared. So that, of course, they still sink people before people write into you, say, my dad was sunk in, whatever it was in 1944. Of course, they still are able to sink vessels and they're still able to, have an impact. But, in grand strategic terms, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to come of this, right? So I think there's, in terms of that aspect of historiography, I think, concentrating, again, it comes down to a little bit to that top down, the question of perspective you mentioned earlier. If you look at particularly that Churchill quote and you look at it without looking at the German sources in any depth, you might run with that assumption that this was a close run thing. It kind of wasn't. The German sources tell us that it kind of wasn't really. So that's one aspect where, at the risk of kind of, running down the strategic significance of the theatre that I've just written a book about, I think that to me is the only honest conclusion to make on it.
It does seem like it would be a perfect chapter in one of those "What If" World War II books.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
you said, if there was the right window, if everything clicked.
Yeah, and that Dönitz, he'd had the focus earlier on. He'd had raw materials. If he'd had his 300 U-boat force, in 1940, when the window is still open, then yeah, I mean, absolutely, that is a fascinating counterfactual. What would have happened? I think, the chances are, given all of the necessary sort of long tail to that, to just run that counterfactual, I think there would have been a Western response, right? It would have been another red flag of pre-war rearmament that maybe would have brought a Western response. But again, what that response might have been, how effective that would have been, is an open question.
Yeah.
But it's pretty clear that he did not have the force that he wanted in anything like the numbers when the window was open, and by the time he had the numbers, the window had gone.
Roger, now that you are in the depths of promoting this book and talking about this book, do you already have your eyes on another topic?
I do, actually. I've already got another book ready to go, which is on the Night of the Long Knives. So I'm sort of shifting again. I'm going back to Third Reich political history, and it's a great subject. It's the Nazi purge of 1934, as you know, which is fascinating. It's sort of inherently dramatic, of course. And it's one that, remarkably, for which there isn't a single volume. There isn't a single volume history out there. So,
It's time.
give me another 2 years and I'll plug that gap.
That's awesome. Roger, thank you so much for joining me today. This really was a pleasure.
My pleasure, Peter. Thanks for having me.